All right. No walking for me today. I'm not going to get my steps in. All right, let me start over. So I'm Jeremy York, lead consultant and president with Invigorate HR. I am also the past president for HR Indiana SHRM. I am also the current membership advisory council member for National SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management. How many of you are familiar and you've heard SHRM before? Just a few of you, okay. Well, SHRM is a great resource for you because I know all of you are responsible for the human resource function of where you're at. And SHRM is a resource. It's a membership-driven organization, a national organization. It's the largest HR professional association in the world. And the website address is just shrm.org. And I highly encourage you to check it out. Now, SHRM has chapters in every state across the country. I oversee as the Membership Advisory Council member of the North Central region, which is 10 states in the Midwest, and Indiana being one of those. And we have 13 SHRM chapters in the state of Indiana. So you might want to check in your local area to see if there is a SHRM chapter that can be a resource for you. From that standpoint, if there's no local resource close by, you can always look at the state resource, or you can go to National SHRM and become a member. I think membership to join SHRM to get all of the great resources is roughly, I think it's $210 per year for a national membership. And it gives you all of these resources, the most updated information, changes regarding laws, any of those kinds of things to help you keep up to date. It's really a great resource, especially, how many of you remember when the changes went into effect for the Fair Labor Standards Act not too long ago? There was a few years ago where we were working very diligently to make these changes, then they went on hold, then they did them again, but changed the salary component, all of that. So SHRM was instrumental in being able to do that. What else it was instrumental in? Have you guys ever heard of this thing called COVID? No? All new to you? I think it impacted our world the last 18 months and still impacts it today. But when COVID struck and we had to start dealing with COVID in the workplace, SHRM provided a ton of resources, toolkits, everything that was just amazing for us as HR professionals to be able to use. So that was worth it in itself. So that is all of my SHRM sales pitch for you today. That is, like I said, is volunteer membership organization. I am a volunteer for SHRM from all of that. We also have the HR Indiana State Conference, which is August 2nd through the 4th in Indianapolis. So you might want to check into that too. It's great as a resource as well. All right, well, let's get into what we're going to be talking about here today overall. Let's see, there we go. So we're going to talk about a lot of things. How many of you are new in your role? Okay, quite a few. How many of you are maybe 1 to 3 years into your role? How many of you are 3+ years? All right, we've got a good mix of everyone here today. So I've tried to put together a presentation for you where it gives you a lot of information, maybe not too detailed because we always can't go into the details because there's a lot to talk about, but very high level, enough to get you into the point to where you go back to your job and you're sticking around and you think, oh, wait a minute, hey, this situation, this sounds familiar. Oh, that guy down at that conference down in Nashville, though he talked about that, the tall, dorky-looking guy. Yeah, he talked about that, right? And you'll remember that, and so you'll go and say, hey, I need to pay attention to that to look it up. It's not expected that you have all of this stuff memorized. It's important that you maybe don't know it all, but you know where to get the information. That's what's really important. That's what makes you smart, is that you know where to go to get the information, whether it's online or through another type of resource like a consultant or through SHRM or something of that nature, okay? So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to review the Fair Labor Standards Act, or what we call the FLSA, and we're going to try to gain a little deeper understanding of what that means and how it impacts you, okay? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to explore personnel policy best practices, things that you should be looking at or paying attention to as it relates to those personnel policies. We're going to discuss FMLA, or the Family and Medical Leave Act, and HIPAA, and also about how things are used concurrently. Other types of paid leave are used concurrently with family and medical leave. FMLA. Then we're also going to understand the difference in HR and payroll in some of the private sector versus public sector organizations. So how many of you that are newer in your job, say 1 to 3 years, came from the private sector? and hadn't necessarily worked in the public sector before. So a few of you. So you'll note there are some major differences as it relates to some of the laws and how we treat employees and things of that nature, especially when we get into police and fire, right? It is a little different than everyone else. So we'll cover that. So let's start with the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act. So basically, what we understand with the FMLSA is that it gives us the minimum wage requirement. It helps us understand also overtime, what that is and how we pay overtime, how we calculate overtime, all of those things. It also helps us understand record-keeping requirements of what we need to do as far as recording time, and we'll talk through some of that. But recording time, keeping time records, things of that nature. Also, exemptions from overtime requirements. How many people know the difference between an exempt and a non-exempt employee? What is it? All right, and crickets. Those of you who raised your hand, what's the difference between an exempt and a non-exempt employee? Non-exempt employees are subject to overtime. Okay, can everybody be a non-exempt employee? Can everyone be a non-exempt employee? What do you think? No? How many people think it's yes? Yes, any employee can be a non-exempt employee, but not every employee can be an exempt employee. Why? Remember, exempt is exempt from overtime. We don't pay them overtime. Why? Well, okay, their salary, yep, they're paid salary, but just being salary, does that exempt them from overtime? No. Why are they exempt from overtime? See, they didn't tell you that I was going to make you think today, right? What are your thoughts? Right. There are rules established by the government about who can be exempt from overtime because they don't want employers to take advantage of not having to pay people for the time that is worked. And we'll get into that. I was just trying to get you all warmed up. Instead of doing jumping jacks, we're doing mental gymnastics this morning with all of that. So that's something that we're going to talk about. We're also talk about child labor laws and what those are. And if you have any type of youngsters working for you or anything of a certain age, people that are less than 16 years of age, less than 17 years of age, FLSA drives that on what kind of requirements are out there, how many hours they can work, what their schedule is, things of that nature. Okay. One thing to also say is that if you have any questions throughout this, just raise your hand or blurt it out or what have you, and we will answer those because I know this is going to probably generate a lot of questions as we talk through some of these things here. So let's make a note about the FLSA, is that it exempts some state and local government employees, means that the FLSA does not apply to those particular individuals. And these are people who aren't necessarily subject to what we call the civil service laws from the FLSA. And these are people such as elected officials. You don't have any of those folks working for you, right? So elected officials, their policy advisors, and members of their personal staff, and any legislative branch members or employees of that. Those are folks where the FLSA doesn't apply to them. That means that we don't necessarily have to pay them overtime, we don't necessarily have to track their time or anything like that, that the FLSA does not apply to those groups of people. So you will have to understand and know what that means as far as it relates to the folks that you're employing. But anyone who is an employee who is not part of this group, yes, the FLSA does apply to them, and that you will have to make sure that you're following the FLSA guidelines from this. I've also included in this presentation the section that explains this. There is tons of law that is out there, and it's important that you know where to go and find the information when you have it. And this is the section that carves out specifically from the FLSA about the elected officials, their policy advisors, members of their staff, et cetera, from that standpoint. But so to remember, FLSA pretty much applies to everyone except for this particular group of people that you might be working with. Here's why you need to understand and know this information is one, that wage and hour issues are one of the biggest and most costly errors or mistakes that happen within an organization, right? And so it's critical to the function of any operation and understanding what it is key to understanding who can be exempt, who can be non-exempt, who needs to get overtime, who doesn't get overtime, who needs to track their time, who doesn't, how we pay those folks. And we have to understand it because it governs everything that we do. Some of the most significant lawsuits that we have to do with overtime as it relates to the FLSA and people not getting paid overtime. And so when employees go after their employer and try to sue them or go after them for not receiving the overtime, they typically, if they win, are awarded not only the back pay that they're due, but also penalty charges on top of that as well for not paying the overtime, because the burden of proof is always on you to understand what the law is, how you're supposed to be operating, and how you're supposed to be working with these particular employees, right, and what's due to them. From a compliance standpoint, it impacts compensation strategies on how you determine how you're going to pay people, what that looks like for understanding who's going to be eligible for overtime and who isn't. Also, determining who's exempt and non-exempt status from that standpoint. Again, with exempt and non-exempt, that is all determined based on this criteria that the government has set forth on who can be exempt from overtime. So we have this criteria that people have two things. They have to meet what's called, one, the duties test. Do their duties qualify? And number two, does their salary qualify? And the new salary change says that a person to be exempt has to make a minimum of $35,568. Anything less than that, they cannot be exempt. More than that, they can be, but they have to meet those types of criteria. There's these different exemptions underneath the FLSA, one being like administrative, learned professional, executive, all of these things. These are all things that you've got to be familiar with that the FLSA outlines for you to understand if your jobs are exempt or non-exempt. I work with a lot of different clients and they think, oh, well, their salary, they're exempt. Well, a lot of people think that, but that doesn't necessarily make them exempt from overtime because they have to meet those tests that the government has set forth underneath the duties and the salary test from that standpoint. So here's a question for you. Can I be salaried and non-exempt? How many people, raise your hand if you say yes, you can be salaried and non-exempt? How many people say no? Raise your hands. How many say, I don't really know? Raise your hands. And that's okay. That's why we're here today. So, yes, you can be on salary and be non-exempt. There is such a thing under the law called a salaried non-exempt employee, where they are guaranteed a certain salary per week, but if they work overtime, they do have to be paid that overtime. So, for example, I work with some clients where they pay an employee, X amount of dollars. And no matter if they work 35 or 40 hours per week, that's what they're getting paid the entire time. But as soon as they work more past that 40-hour per week threshold, they are being paid overtime from that standpoint. So there is a salaried non-exempt component as well. So this is where it can get really complicated sometimes if you really don't know your way around some of the FLSA laws to understand what those are. So it's important that you understand it from compliance. And definitely from a risk management standpoint, because you play an important role in managing the risks of the organization where you're at and what you're doing, right? And depending on what your role is and how much of your role falls underneath HR, I know you're all auditors and it's different levels of HR at different locations where you're at. But you've got to understand that you play an important part in risk management from all of this. So you want to make sure that you're on top of it, avoiding any types of risks, making sure that you understand. And if you don't know, it's okay to ask questions and to research it and to say, hey, I'll have to look into that. Like I said, you aren't expected to have all of this kind of stuff memorized. It's impossible. I've been in this business in HR for over 20 years. I don't have it all memorized. But you just got to know where to go and find the right resources to answer your questions or to solve the problems that you're facing from that standpoint. So you also need to know that hours of work are important to pay attention to. What are hours of work and what is, should the person be paid for? Well, underneath the Fair Labor Standards Act, it says that employees must be compensated for any work that is paid or any work performed. They must be paid for that. Any work that is performed, they must be paid for non-exempt. For exempt, it's different because they're exempt from overtime. And some of these work hours and things might be travel time while they're working. Now, I'm not talking about travel time to work from their home. That's not compensable. But I'm talking about if they have to travel during the workday for company business or organization business where, hey, I'm over here at the street department and I've got to drive over to, the other department or to the main headquarters to go do this or whatever, to the town hall. That is compensable time to do the work. Or I'm in the parks department and I've got to drive to the street department. That is all compensable time. They do get paid for that kind of work hours. Or if we ask them to go run an errand on behalf of the organization or go somewhere on behalf of the organization, we have to pay them. It is compensable time at that point for travel time, but not travel time to get to work in the morning from the home or anything of that nature. Does that make sense to everyone? We also have to look at split shifts. So how many of you run split shifts with any of your folks? Some? So when I'm talking about split shifts, I'm talking about, this person's going to work from 8 to noon, and then they're going to pick back up and work from 2 to 6 or something like that from a split shift. They're only have to be compensated in their split shift for when they're actually working. You don't have to compensate them for that break in between. That's not something you have to pay them for unless it impacts their personal time. If they are expected from their job to be within a 3-mile radius or something of that nature that would significantly impact their personal activities, then it may be compensable. If you're restricting them to where they cannot be somewhere they need to go or could go, etc., it may be compensable. Otherwise, it is not considered compensable on that time, right? So from a split shift. Training programs, lectures, and meetings. So if they're going to a meeting, they're going to a training program or anything like that, that is compensable time. Even for a question that I get a lot of times is, well, what about when a person has to fill out their new hire paperwork or any of that kind of stuff? Do they get paid for that? Yes, they do. Filling out their new hire paperwork, because that is work. That is something they're doing for you. If they have to go to a training, if they have to go to a meeting somewhere, off-site, a retreat, any of those things, and they're there, they have to be compensated for that at that point. A lot of times people will say, well, what about the travel time for them to go to the meeting or to go to wherever they need to be? Well, it all depends. If it's an exempt employee, travel time doesn't matter from that. But if it's a non-exempt employee, it's very likely that that travel time would be compensable. So we have to understand how that all works together when we look at that. Holidays, vacations, and sick days. Now, this is a one where a lot of people get tripped up sometimes. So how many of you include your holidays, vacations, and sick days toward overtime calculations? Anybody? Maybe you don't know? And you're saying maybe? Holiday time you do? So the Flsa does not require that we include any non-paid work time, or paid non-work time is what I want to say. Paid non-work time does not require us to include that toward overtime calculations. Now, a lot of organizations, they will do that. They will say, hey, like we'll include holiday time, but we're not going to include vacation or sick time. Others will say, well, we're going to include all paid time off toward the calculation of overtime. This is really up to you, but the important thing is what? You have a policy or something that states so, right? That says, yes, we do count this particular grouping of time toward overtime, or we do not count that toward overtime, that it's very clear on whether or not it's going to be calculated toward overtime, right? Because employees want to know that. Right? Because they don't always understand it. They don't always understand how overtime is calculated. All they know is that I worked more than 40 hours. I should be paid more. I should be paid overtime and all of that. So you've got to be very clear about how you treat holiday, vacation, and sick time with all of that. What about medical attention? What do you think about that? Is that considered paid time? Should we compensate employees for medical attention? Bueller? Bueller? What do you think? I don't know. I don't know. Which one is it? Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Does that sound right to everyone? Oh, you can't hear. Okay. Well, everyone turn it up. Turn it up. No. So here's the thing. She said, well, it would depend, right? Like, well, if it's workers' compensation and we're sending them to our medical clinic or something like that, yeah, that would be paid time, right, for work. But if they're just calling in sick or a part-time employee that doesn't have sick time and is calling in sick or something like that, no, that wouldn't be paid, right? Does that sound right? Yeah, exactly. So medical attention, anytime that we're sending them for medical attention because of something that's work-related, whether we're requiring them to go to take a drug test or we're requiring them to go to the clinic because they injured themselves at work, right? Anything like that. Or if we have reasonable suspicion or they were injured, had a workplace accident or something like that, we may send them for a drug test or a medical attention. Yes, that's all paid time. But no, not just because they get sick or they come to work and they're like, I'm not feeling well, I'm going to leave the rest of the day. No, that's not necessarily time that we're going to pay as the employer. That's what their sick time or their paid time off is for those types of things. So just remember that. But anything that's work-related, it's a work-related type injury, or we've asked them to do something, to go to seek medical attention, yes, they would be compensated for that. But what about report-in pay? So when we talk about report-in pay is, so let's say that all of a sudden at our work location, the power's out. We can't come into work, right? The power's out, right? And we don't have a backup generator or anything like that. So employees aren't coming into work that day. Are we required to pay them? Yes? How many people say yes? How many people say no? How many people say, I don't know? Exactly. Common scenario. It does happen, right? Things happen. And like if a workplace closes, no, underneath the Fair Labor Standards Act, you are not required to pay them if your electricity goes out or if bad weather permits and doesn't allow people to come into work and you close down the facility or any of those kind of things. You do not have to pay them. Do most employers or organizations do that? A lot of them, yes, they will, because they understand that it's not the employee's fault from all that. But the FLSA does not say you have to. That's why it's important to have a policy in place to be able to outline what is your practice on doing this, an inclement weather policy that outlines that, or if there's an office shutdown or something like that, that type of policy to outline how you will handle that with employees from that standpoint. Okay, so that's what we call, kind of report-in pay, whether or not they actually have to be paid for those types of things that happen from that standpoint. So overtime in general, just some things to know, that overtime is paid at 1.5 times a non-exempt employee's hourly rate. And employees' rights to overtime cannot be waived, with an exception, and we'll get to that. What's that called? Anybody know? It's not really waiving them, it's more of an exchange. Comp time, right? We'll talk about that. But so an employee can't waive their right to overtime or comp time from that perspective. If they work, guess what? They're not exempt. They have to receive something in return for that. So we have to make sure that we understand it. How many times has an employee said, oh, well, I worked over these hours, but I don't need to be paid for those? Has anyone had employees say that? Yeah, I've seen employees. Very few anymore, right? But it does happen, and that's when we say, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We have to pay you. If you've worked, we have to pay you from that standpoint. We also have to understand that averaging hours is prohibited. I've seen a lot of employers trying to average hours in a pay cycle to say, oh, well, they worked 45 hours this week, but only worked 35 hours the next week. And then, so that's 80 hours for the 2-week pay period. We're good. No, it doesn't work that way. You can't average hours for a pay period. Any time worked over 40 in a pay period is overtime in the state of Indiana. Unless sometimes, you're a municipality or wherever you're at, it could be a little different there, but I don't believe Indiana has any of those that's any different. For example, California, they require any hours over an 8-hour workday be overtime in the state of California. Indiana is not there. So we still say in Indiana that any hours worked over 40 in a work week is it qualifies for overtime from that standpoint. So it is 40 hours in a work week. Now, this will be a little different for police and fire, and we'll get to that point and we'll talk about that. But for non-police and fire employees, everyone else, we have to understand that. Holiday sick pay may not be included unless otherwise stated. We need to have that policy as we talked about. On-call and travel time may be included. We didn't really talk about on-call pay and on-call time. How many of you have that? Do you have those situations where people are on call? While they are on call or serving on call, do you pay them? Yeah, do you pay them while they're on call? Only when what? Only when they receive a call, okay? Somebody else said, I think you raised your hand. You said you pay them for on call, right? You in the polka dot, I think polka dot. Did you say yes? Okay. Who else pays people for on call? Yep. Per hour per call. So the entire time they're on call, you're paying them from that standpoint. Okay. So there's not an easy answer to this one because it's kind of a practice. Here's the most easiest answer that I can give you. If your on-call status significantly impacts them from doing their personal business, again, if it's restricting them. So for on-call, I've seen, especially for maintenance type positions or anything like that, hey, you have to be within a 30-minute radius of where we're at. 30 minutes, maybe not so much. We may not have to pay them for that 30-minute radius all the time. We would just have to pay them per call if they get it. But if we're saying, I need you to be within a 3-mile radius of this facility at all particular times, yeah, we probably need to compensate them for the on-call time. It all depends on how restrictive we're being with them. But the easiest approach in most scenarios is to pay them a rate during that on-call time and then to pay them per call like you're doing from that standpoint. But it all depends on how restrictive it's being in that particular situation with that employee. One thing that you probably already know about working in HR is that it's not always black and white. There are a million shades of gray, and every situation's a little different, and we all have to look at it from that standpoint. We also have to look at that as far as when do we pay overtime, and then it has to be paid on the next regular pay date, right, or the next regular pay cycle. So if they, when they work it, it needs to be paid on that next regular pay date. We can't withhold it. We can't wait to pay it later or anything like that when we're speaking specifically about overtime. Yes, question? Yes. Well, she is supposed to be paying them for, and it all depends on when, with the police and fire, they are supposed to be paid once they've reached that period of when their overtime is due to them. They are supposed to be paid that overtime the very next pay cycle. So it might work out, depending on when police and fire, when they work, it might work out to where it's once a month based on their schedule, but it should be the very next pay cycle. And I can't imagine that every pay cycle that it's due is only once a month. So the FLSA is pretty clear that it should be at the very next pay cycle for when they earn it. So for police and fire, it could be a little longer window based on when those hours are calculated for them. So might be something just to kind of look at to make sure that you're being compliant. Any other questions on overtime? Yes. Oh, that's a great question. Do part-timers get overtime? What do you think? Yes? Why? Exactly. Anybody who works over 40 hours in a work week is due overtime. Yes. So part-timers, they may be, and we do have this at a lot of places that we see where somebody's working 20 hours a week, right? And they're just part-time. But somebody goes on vacation and they pick up for them that week of vacation and they end up working 42, 43 hours a week. That week they work it, they would be due overtime for that because it's over 40 in that work week. That's like the basis of the FLSA. So if you just look up FLSA overtime regulations and you Google that, you will find it because it's any employee. And actually, I think you might have just segued into. Well, no, I do have it. I do have it on here. One of these. Yeah, calculating overtime. It does talk about part-timers being due that, so you can take the presentation too. But FLSA is where you're going to get the actual verbiage from the law that talks about that, about anyone who works over 40 hours. Yes. Yep. Okay, that's a great question. Do part-timers get holiday pay? And this is where I say it depends. It depends, number one, on how your policy is written. And number two, I would say it really would depend on, does the holiday fall on their normal scheduled work day? So this is where it gets back to having important policies and having that spelled out. Some organizations say part-timers are not eligible for holiday pay or sick pay or PTO or anything like that. If your policy states that, they are not eligible. However, if you do have a policy, it could be that it's based on their schedule, when they work, any of those things. From that standpoint. So that's really up to you and what your policies state. Got a third one? All right, just checking. All right, so overtime, police and fire. So this is Section 7K of the FLSA, and it's what provides that employees engaged in fire protection or law enforcement may be paid overtime on a work period basis. So based on their work time. And this is really interesting because they've created this entire formula. The DOL has a formula for police, and they have a formula for fire. And it says a work period may be from 7 consecutive days to 28 consecutive days in length, depending on what you determine that to be, right? And so for the DOL, it says for the work periods of at least 7 but less than 28, overtime pay is required when the number of hours worked exceeds the number of hours that bears the same relationship to 212 hours for fire or 171 hours for police as the number of the days in the work period bears to 28. So basically, it has to be within that period. So for example, fire protection personnel are due overtime under such a plan after 106 hours worked during a 14-day period, while the law enforcement personnel must receive overtime after 86 hours worked during a 14-day work period. So they are equivocating 212 hours to 28 days and 171 hours for police to 28 days in that particular period. And so that's the formula. So that's why this example says if we take that formula and we're looking at a 14-day work period, that's the number of hours that a person would have, that's the threshold that a person would have to cross as police or fire to be eligible for overtime. Okay? So this is the one that's really interesting. I have no idea, do not ask me, I have no idea how the DOL came up with these numbers or this formula, but this is the Department of Labor under the FLSA. This is their law that they have and the guidance that they have on being able to calculate overtime for police and fire. And they are, obviously, it's different than every other employee from that standpoint. So I would definitely encourage you to be familiar with this in your areas as well from that standpoint. So here we go, overtime versus comp time. Now, the clarification I like to help everyone understand is that, comp time may be paid in lieu of overtime with certain specifications. Now, comp time is not something that is allowed in the private sector, okay? This is specific to the public sector. When we're in the private sector, we have to pay overtime. Comp time is not something that we can do for employees. However, in the public sector, it's something that you can give. And the purpose for that is to help control budgets, to help allow those budgets. So do all of you feel like you're pretty familiar with comp time? Have a good, decent understanding? I mean, it is a great benefit to help employees and help everyone manage what that time period is for overtime. So comp time has to be paid at a rate of 1.5 hours for each hour of overtime. It's calculated on a 40-hour-a-week basis. So if a person were to have overtime, you calculate comp time the same way, if that's what we're going to do. And it is capped at 240-hour maximum for non-police and fire, or a 480-hour maximum for police and fire. They can't exceed any more than that number from that standpoint, okay? So, for example, an office assistant for the city earns $16 an hour, and last week she worked a total of 52 hours. Because she exceeded the 40-hour-a-week threshold by 12 hours, she received 18 hours of comp time, 12 hours times 1.5, instead of overtime pay. When she eventually takes her comp time, those hours will be paid at her usual rate of $16 an hour for a total value of $288, which is 18 hours times 16 an hour for the comp time. Make sense? Any questions around comp time at all? Because I know, how many of you guys use a lot of comp time where you're at? Yeah. Most cities and towns and counties, municipalities, they use a lot of it because it's a way to make sure that your budgets stay in check. Because we know that we have to be budget conscious, and we're balancing that budget from that standpoint. And so comp time is a way for us to be able to really utilize that and to ensure that we're watching those budgets. But the important thing is to make sure that you're managing comp time correctly, and that you're recording comp time correctly, and that you have good record keeping of comp time. Record keeping is important to ensure that whoever is tracking that, is this usually tracked in your payroll office when you're doing it for most of you? Payroll? So to ensure that they're keeping good records of that comp time, et cetera, of what that is. So, calculating overtime, just as a summary here, is that with a fixed 40-hour work week, you simply multiply the regular number of hours by 1.5 for over 40 hours per week. So we understand that. So if an employee gets $20 an hour and they work 45 hours a week, the employee must be paid $30 for each of the 5 overtime hours, right? If we're paying overtime. If the work week is less than 40 hours a week, overtime only kicks in after the employee has worked 40 hours. For example, an employee who normally works a 35-hour work week should be paid at the normal rate of pay for 36 to 40 hours worked in the work week, and would only start to receive overtime after working more than 40 hours in that work week. So again, if it's less than 40, no overtime due. Over 40, overtime due. I know I feel like I sound like a broken record drilling this in, but let me tell you, these are the issues that come up most frequently on being able to calculate and manage overtime for that scenario. Yes? Yeah, so the question was, what else goes into calculating overtime if you have a supplemental wage on top of your base wage from that standpoint? So a lot of it, depending on what you're looking at, it could be where you go back and look at the actual accumulated total for the employee over that particular period if they're getting a supplemental wage. So for example, if they get paid an incentive pay for working a certain kind of hour during that week or anything of that nature, you've got to take that into consideration as well. Is there other kind of pay that you have that you include into that? I'm trying to think of an example specific to everyone here that might go. I mean, I know like the incentive pay, or like if you take a later shift or work a different shift, you might have a higher rate for that. Gotcha. Yeah, so you would look at that and calculate if there's some type of additional pay in there, and especially if there's like a differential pay or anything like that, we would look at what the total is for that particular week, what the hourly earning would be to calculate that overtime, to look at that when we figure out the overtime total for that. Does that make sense? When we look at that? So you just have to kind of treat it, you just got to be aware of that, of what that average might be. Okay? Good question. Anything else with overtime? Yes. No. So the question is, if a work week is 35 hours per week and the person works a total of 40, what do we do with those extra 5 hours that they've actually worked since they don't get overtime? No, so we would pay them their regular rate for those extra 5 hours. It's straight time. 5 hours of straight time. Since they're since comp time is really, and this is where I get a little technical, right? So comp time is really in lieu of overtime. What I would call that is trade time, right? So if they work those, and you could count that as 5 hours of comp time if you want, but it's just going to be hour for hour instead of 1.5 if you wanted to do that from that standpoint. So that is something you could do. Now, I would technically, and this gets a little muddy, I would want to explore that a little bit more on whether or not you truly could give them comp time hours for that, since it's not overtime when they should be working. I would say that it's probably a fine gray line, and that would be a question I'd want to have like a little legal counsel discussion with on someone, just to make sure we were okay. It sounds like we would be, but I would question that just a little bit. That would raise a little red flag for me. Yes. She said, what happens if you have an employee that works in one department but fills in the other department? So under the Flsa, it really doesn't matter that they work in different departments. It's going to be, if they go over 40 hours per week working in both departments, they're going to be qualified for overtime or comp time from that standpoint. Now, where it would become a little bit of a mess, depending on how you do your budgeting, is who gets billed for what. And so if I was one department and I was like, well, your hours caused this person to go over 40, I'm going to bill you for that. You got to work that out internally about how you're going to record that financially. But it doesn't matter if they're in two different departments. If they work more than 40 and the same employer, then it's overtime. Yeah. Good question, though, because I know that happens a lot, right? That happens a lot for the fill-ins. Any other questions out there? No? All right. Oops. All right, so other time issues, required overtime. You have the right with reasonable limits to require overtime for folks. So we can require overtime. I would encourage you to have a policy that says that you can require overtime from that standpoint, but with reasonable limits. Like, you know, we can't require anything unreasonable for a person, but we can require overtime. Unauthorized overtime. This is something that comes up that's usually kind of big, because a lot of employers say, well, I didn't authorize you to work those hours. I'm not paying you. Well, that doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So if someone has unauthorized overtime, you have to pay them for that work that they are actually doing, even if you didn't authorize it, because then it's a performance issue. Okay? It's a performance issue, and make sure that you have a policy that says overtime must be authorized in advance, and you can manage performance accordingly from that standpoint, but you still have to pay them or give them the comp time from that. You can't not pay them, right? From that standpoint. Meals. You don't have to pay employees for meal periods, nor does the time count for overtime purposes if employees are completely relieved of work duties during the meal period. However, if they are not relieved of the work duties, if you get saying you can eat your food and work, guess what? You have to pay them. It also is a little different for police and fire. We understand they're in their own kind of little carve out over here, but it's a little different for them. But we don't have to compensate for meal periods. Work breaks, you don't have to compensate for work breaks either. However, if the breaks are 15 to 20 minutes are offered, they count as work time. So something to kind of look at, what those rest breaks are and what that is. For some reason, I hear this a lot. People say, oh, well, I'm guaranteed 2 15-minute breaks a day. Well, no, you're not really. The state law doesn't require that, neither does the federal. If you're under a collective bargaining agreement, you might be for something like that, but not necessarily. It's this kind of become customary that people do that, and it'll be in their policy. So I would encourage you to have good policies as it relates to work time and work breaks. Sleep time. Here's a good one, right? I know it probably impacts a lot of folks. Do we pay for sleep time? Depends. That's a great answer. That is a great answer. What does it depend on? Your policy. Yep. So she said that her EMS, they receive sleep time at a lower rate than the regular work time. And so in that particular situation, yes, a lot of times with fire and EMS, they are paid for sleep time because they are being restricted. They have to be there at that facility in case of an emergency. So therefore, they're being restricted. They have to be there, right? But for other sleep time, maybe not. We may not necessarily have to pay for that. It does depend on our policy and what that is. And, for me to go take a nap during the middle of the day, no, probably not going to pay that from that standpoint, right? Probably not going to do that. But other positions may require sleep time, such as, EMS. That makes sense. Fire makes sense, where they have to be at the firehouse or the location ready to go in case they're called from that standpoint. Make sense? Clear? Yes. Work breaks. Yes. So, employer offers 2 15-minute paid work breaks a day. But the employee doesn't take the work breaks and comes up and says, hey, I want to leave 30 minutes early because I didn't take those. What do you think? She's asking, can we do that? No? Oh, I heard the magic word. Who said it? It depends. Right, so can you do it? Yes. But do you want it to become a common practice? Probably not. So in that particular situation, I would have a conversation with the employee and say, well, help me understand, how come you didn't talk to me about this before this happened? Or tell me understand what your need is. Do you need to be out 30 minutes to go pick your kid up early from school? Yeah, that's fine. We can work that out, but that's not going to happen every day, right? Oh, you want that to happen every day? Well, do we need to look at a schedule change? Maybe you need to come in at 7:30 and work 7:30 to 4:30 instead of, 8 to 5 if you need to get out here 30 minutes early. There's all these different things. It's a very gray situation depending on, 1, your policy, number 2, your culture of the organization, and number 3, what your typical practices are, and number 4, the employee's job. Maybe you need them there that last 30 minutes of the day because it's critical to the operation of what you're doing, right? Maybe it's because there's no coverage. I don't know. But it depends in that particular situation. But employees are pretty smart about trying to figure those kind of things out and cheat the system, so that's a good example overall. Yeah. Anybody ever had that happen? I'm sure you did since you asked the question, but yeah, those kind of things do happen there. All right, ready to move on? Oh, question, yes. Smoke breaks. Smoke breaks, vape breaks, tobacco use breaks, like where I need to go up and I need to get a little dip just for a minute, and then, yep, those kind of things too, it does happen. So what's your question about them? Are they paid or not paid, or do we have to offer them or what? So, smoke breaks, any of that kind of stuff, they're not a thing, right? Unless you have a policy that says they are, which most places don't, because you're trying to drive your health insurance costs down, not up, right? So you don't really have a smoke break policy. And so in that kind of scenario, it's if you need a cigarette or you need to smoke or anything like that, you do that on your other break time or your lunch time. Smoke breaks aren't a thing, at least. And I'm being a little facetious with that, right? But they're not a thing. I'm sorry if I offend any smokers in here. I'm sorry. But they're just not a thing. And so we don't have to pay for those. And then people do that on their own time. We don't have to allow them to do that. So, which I'm ready for and I shouldn't say this, I shouldn't speak it into existence, but I'm waiting for the day the ADA comes and say nicotine addiction is covered and they have to have smoke time to be able to do that. So I'm not putting that out there, but the world we live in, I'm like, why has this not happened? Everything else has from that standpoint. All right, so recording work time. So this is important. This is something I want to make sure that we understand, is that it's an important issue since it impacts overtime and other pay issues, right? So time clocks are not required, but you can use them if you need them. You can have them, but they're not a requirement or anything like that, especially for tracking non-exempt employee time. I do caution you, don't treat exempt employees like non-exempt employees. I would not recommend you having exempt employees clock in and out, track their time or anything like this unless it's at an exception basis. And what I mean by that is that, yes, we can require exempt employees to track their PTO and their time off, their sick days or anything like that, but not, I've got to clock in the morning and clock out for lunch and all these kind of things if you're exempt, because you will put their exemption, it will subject them to say, hey, you're mistreating them and they're really classified as non-exempt and now you're going to owe all this overtime pay and back pay and all this other kind of stuff. So just don't put that exemption in jeopardy by treating them like a non-exempt employee. Yes? So she says all of their employees have to complete a timesheet. Well, I would say, so she said, so they have to complete a timesheet, and that's because if you're an exempt employee, and that's how we know if you work 40 hours a week or not, because what if you work 30, then you're going to have to use 10 hours of your paid time to get a full week of pay. Well, here's what I'm going to say is that, and this is no way legal advice, put that disclaimer there. You're treating that person like a non-exempt employee, and you're really putting their exemption in jeopardy of, qualifying for overtime, et cetera, because under the law of FLSA, a non-exempt person has to be paid for hourly, but an exempt person, they can perform work of 15 minutes in one day, and you have to pay them for the full day. So you're really putting them in a position to where, one, it doesn't sound like you're trusting them, but two, that you're also treating them in a way that does not align with exempt status. Exempt status means we pay you a salary of X dollars no matter how much you work or how little you work. This is what it is. So I would be very careful about that, because that is a practice that I would probably work against for exempt folks, because you're treating them like non-exempt people from that standpoint. And so, and then if the person's only working 30 hours in the week and we're tracking how much time, then the manager needs to understand and have a conversation with them about your workload or et cetera, or did you just need time off from that standpoint? Yes. Well, keeping time records is one thing, right? So keeping time records doesn't mean I have to fill out a timesheet every day on what time I clock in and clock out, because you want to avoid ghost employment. I know that's a big part of it, but keeping time records is just showing that the time record is this person's exempt and that this is how they're exempt and paid for 40 hours a week. And we keep time records by showing that they actually requested PTO or whatever, and we utilize that by an exempt, what I call by exception, right? I say we track their time by exception versus in real time like we do a non-exempt person. So that's why you have to keep those records. Absolutely. You have to have payroll records for every employee. You have to have payroll records for and time records for. But the way that we keep with it exempt is different than from a non-exempt standpoint. Yes, absolutely, because we want to be able to show that we're not facilitating or encouraging ghost employment or any of those kinds of things that we have, right, from that standpoint. But that is the big thing, is unless, so I'm going to go back to your question again, because unless there is a business reason, for example, here's a reason why an exempt person may have to track their time. If there are grants that we have to be able to allocate the role to, or something that we receive from the state or what have you that says we have to show how much time goes to this grant, that could be a reason why we would do it. from a department billing, if the person works between two different departments and we need them to break down their work so we know how to bill that department, we could do that. If there is a literal business purpose behind why we're having them do that, we can support that. For example, like if a person was doing, maybe they're consulting with other departments, right? And you're billing out their time and you're having that time allocated to those departments, something like that. But just for the sure part of having a person just track their time just to see whether or not they're at work or they're not at work, that is considered a, just something that we wouldn't do for an exempt level employee, because we put that exemption in jeopardy because we're treating them like a non-exempt employee for having them track their time. And there have been plenty of legal cases. Again, I'm not an attorney, I'm not giving legal advice, but there have been plenty of legal cases out there that has illustrated where people have done that. What happened was, oh, guess what? You're treating that person like a non-exempt employee, and guess what else you did? You tracked all their time, and so now I get to show how much overtime and all that kind of stuff that, thank you for doing that work for us, that you're going to have to pay them now because of the tracking. Now, yes, I am being a little overzealous here, and I am trying to scare you and all that, so you walk out of here thinking those things. But you need to be scared about certain things like that. That's the stuff I want you to think about when you go back to your jobs and say, okay, what did that goofy guy say about what? Yeah. Answer your question? Okay. Was there another question? I thought maybe I saw one over here. Maybe no? All right. You are not obligated to pay employees who voluntarily come in before their work or voluntarily stay after their regular stopping time unless they're actually working. So I've known people, I've seen this. They come in, they clock in, then I mosey on over to the coffee machine, to the vending, get my snacks, come and have my breakfast, and come back to work. Sorry, that's not compensable time. You're not working. You don't get to show up at 8 and say you're working and then take 8 to 8:20 to do your breakfast. That's not how this works. But people do it, see it all the time, right? So we don't have to pay them if they come in early or all that kind of stuff if they're not working from that standpoint, or if they're staying late and they're not working, right? So just know that. If you should not fail to count any part, however, small of an employee's regular work time. So again, I don't care if an employee stays over 10 minutes, track that because they really need to be paid for that. That's compensable. Anytime they work, just remember for non-exempt employees, all hours worked, all hours paid. And rounding off starting and stopping time to the nearest 5, 10, or 15 minutes is permitted. A lot of times people will do this, whatever your payroll system will track. I've seen payroll systems track down to the minute, and they utilize that. I've seen other ones that round 0.25 hours. You can utilize that as well. Just remember that if an employee works like 10 minutes, you can't round them down. You need to round them up to what the next one is, right? From that standpoint. Questions on recording work time? Part-time and FLSA, here we go. I knew I had a slide about this for you. Part-time people under FLSA have to be paid minimum wage. They're normally paid an hourly wage, and they're considered non-exempt. And if they do work over 40, they must be paid overtime like anyone else. We talked about that. And part-time employees must also receive equal pay for substantially equal work. That means if I've got this job X and I pay this person $15 an hour, but then I got this job X, which is the exact same, but I want to pay this person $10 an hour because they're part-time, it's not really going to fly. I mean, you can do it. Do you have issues to be worried about? Yes, if it's solely because the person's part-time. If anything, part-timers usually make more money because they're not paid benefits. From that standpoint. So just kind of pay attention to that, but they are considered to have equal pay. And especially if your part-timer happens to be part of a protected class, that's really not good from that standpoint, if they're making less than their non-protected class counterpart. Contractors under FLSA, they aren't governed by FLSA. Contractors, why? Why? They're not employees, exactly. Contractors are contractors, so therefore FLSA doesn't apply. And I know that you'll love this, the first bullet point that says, although there is no true definition of an independent contractor, which we know there isn't, because what happens? The government keeps changing it every few years, right? The government has guidelines that they have out there, and they say, guess what, employer? You get to pick. You have to make a decision, and if you make the wrong one, we're going to get you in trouble. So they don't have guidelines, or they don't have a definition, but they do have guidelines, and that does change every so often. A lot of it's politically driven, so it just depends on who's in office, and it waffles back and forth. But just remember, FLSA, contractors don't apply from that standpoint. And also, don't treat a contractor like an employee, because guess what? If you do, they're probably an employee. So think about that. And it all has to come down to the control of how they do their work, the materials that they do their work with, and the frequency or the time period of doing their work and how that work is performed. All right, personnel policies. I'm going to check, see how we're doing on time. Good. We've got just a little shy of 30 minutes, right? I'm good until noon? Is that mine? What's my time schedule? 11:45. Okay, so I got 15, little less than 15 minutes. So we're good. We can do this. Policies, best practices. Here we go. 1, purpose of policies. A lot of people think policies are terrible. They don't like having them, et cetera, et cetera. Policies are your best friend when it comes to managing employees because employees will do whatever they want unless there's policies. And then when you have policies, they'll do whatever they can to find the loophole in the policy. So make sure that you do it well. So 1 is their communication resources. They provide employees with values, procedures, and benefit information. It limits legal liability because guess what? If we have a policy in place that is good, it can protect us against discrimination and unfair treatment of others. And it can also help us say, when the employee says, oh, I didn't know that. Well, I got a handbook here that says the policy in it with your signature on the acknowledgement page. So I think that you did. Yeah. It'll help you with those kind of things if you ever are challenged about that. Administrative time saver, answers questions that arise during employment. So what will happen is, how many of you get questions by employees with answers they could have found in the handbook if they would have looked at it? How many does it bug the doo-doo out of you? It is terrible. It bugs me. I'm just like, go to your handbook. Go to your handbook. It's in there. It's like they don't even think. No, my job is not here to answer your questions on the handbook that you're too lazy to look at. I'm sorry. So anyway, but that's what they're there for. And when the employee sends an email, they call and ask us, say, you know what? Why don't you check your handbook that's listed in there underneath this policy? And then if you have any questions about that, get back with me. But it's there to be able to help drive that so we can focus on the more value-added parts of our job and what we really enjoy doing and what we like to do. So when you have these policies, you want to make sure that they're tailored to fit your organization. This is the big thing, right? Don't just pick a policy from another county, another municipality, another town, another whatever, and say, okay, pick it up and drop it here. No, that doesn't work all the time because the way that you do things is different, and you've got to understand how your organization functions. You also want to scan workplace for practices. So what that means is if there are no policies, you've got to develop them. And if your policies don't align with your practices, you need to update them, right? I've seen a lot of policies be in place that don't actually reflect on how the organization actually works. I was talking to someone just a couple of weeks ago, and we were helping them with a PTO policy and about how accruals work and all this, that, and the other. And I went to the payroll department to talk to that, and payroll goes, well, that's not how we've been doing it. And I said, well, this policy's been in place for the last 5 years. And she goes, well, I don't know. Well, I'm sorry, but here's the policy. This is what we're holding employees accountable to, and they're holding us accountable to. This is how we have to do this from that standpoint. So let's make sure that we've got everything lined up with our practices and our policies. You got to review them. So does your policies reflect the current practice in your organization? And do you really need a policy on this topic? Now, please no one get mad at me or come after me with your pitchforks and fires after this. But there is something about working in the public sector where you people, that's all of you, that's where you work, you people love to make a policy. You want a policy on everything. You want a policy on when somebody can go to the bathroom. I mean, seriously, y'all love policies. Y'all all love policies, and we don't need a policy for everything. We do not need that. So we've got to think about, do we really need a policy for the things that we need it for? Yes, I know you think in the scheme of things it's going to make it clear to employees, but we've already established they don't read it anyway, and they're going to do their thing. So we don't have to make a policy for everything. So just remember that. We don't always have to have it. We've got to figure out what makes sense for the organization. We also want to make sure that we write policies to the level of your employee population. Don't make things complicated. Don't make it should be easy to read and understand. Don't use a bunch of legalese. This is why I always recommend, don't let your attorneys write it, let them review it. Don't let your attorneys write it, let them review it. You write it, or you get with someone else that can help you write it, because you do not want overly legalistic language like whereas, heretofore, and other big words. Your employee handbook should be at an 8th grade reading level. That way everyone can understand it and it's easy for them to be able to interpret. Don't include names of employees or other information that changes frequently. Use things like job titles or something like that instead. I've seen handbooks that say, oh, well, please send your paperwork or this into Carol Smith, treasurer, blah, 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 blah. Okay, 2 years later, Carol's gone. There's the same handbook. Still got Carol's name in it. No, we don't need Carol's name. It's just to the treasurer if that's where it's going to stand. Don't commit to a policy that cannot be enforced. So, for example, no fault attendance policy, strict progressive disciplinary actions, all of those kind of things. You want to make sure that you give yourself enough wiggle room to make the right decision, right? I worked for a place one time that had a no fault attendance policy, and this person, she was a single mom, she was having a hard time, came to work every day and all of that, but was having trouble with the bus because she took the bus every day to work. And she was having trouble getting to work because the bus schedules were running late, et cetera, and she was racking up tardies because they counted this, right? And so she had too many tardies, but was a great employee, and guess what we did? Fired her. Because here this woman was, a single mom, trying to get to work every day on the bus, and the bus was late, and we fired her because she had too many tardies, just as if we had somebody waiting at the door to come and take her job, and we know we don't have that. So don't put yourself in those kinds of situations when you're developing those kinds of policies. Don't ever say you will be fired. We want to say things like further disciplinary action up to termination of employment. We never want to put ourselves in a corner because what did I say earlier? Things aren't black and white. Lots of gray. And avoid language which unduly limits discretion. That's what I'm talking about. Let's have that wiggle room. We need a little bit of that within our policies and what we decide to do. So use the catch-all phrase, unless otherwise required by state. So by state law, et cetera. And, this can be a little different for everyone here because sometimes your municipalities where you're at can be a little different. Your county policies can be different from the state, et cetera. But if we don't know for things like, weapons in the workplace, access to personnel records, family pregnancy leave, payment of termination, accrual vacation, we need to know what it is, and we can always fall back onto whatever the state law would be if, we don't really know what that is. But I would encourage you to figure out what that might be within your particular area if there is something specific to that. And it also, you might want to leave it open just to say this because the state law changes from that standpoint. So you've also got to update and train those policies. So you've got to periodically review and revise to reflect changes regarding the law, policy, and procedure. Know who oversees this process and who should it be done. Who owns your employee handbook? Who's responsible for it? Anybody know? Do you know who it is and where you're at? I bet many of you would be like, you know what? That's a good question. We need to find that out because we have to own that and figure out how we're going to update it. Who's responsible for it? When should it be done? Set a schedule for that. Usually we say we want to update or at least review the handbook every 2 years at a minimum. Every 2 years so that we can make sure that everything's correct from that standpoint. And because different laws change, they apply. It could be from a local resource, et cetera. And the biggest thing is train your managers and supervisors who actually manage people on the policies. They need to know what those policies are just as much as you do. They need to understand it as well so they're not calling you. We want them to know what the policy is, and then if they need clarification, that's when you come into play to be able to help provide some of that insight from an HR standpoint there. All right, so we're going to breeze through this here. I just got a few minutes, so I'm sorry. This has been good. Hopefully, are you guys finding this helpful? Okay, good. So I'm going to get through this really quickly. This was something that I wanted to make sure that we were able to get through. So Fmla, this is a big thing. Fmla, does it apply to you in the private or the public sector? Yes, it does. It doesn't matter how many employees that you have. It applies to you. However, one thing that we need to make sure that we understand is that an eligible employee, you are an eligible employer, so you have eligible employees. But the big thing, and here is something they talk about, and you may have ran into this, people fiddle back and forth on whether or not, just because you're a covered employer, do you have to have 50 employees with a 75-mile radius? Do you guys fiddle back and forth with that part at all? Or do you just cover people whether you have less than 50 employees? Or do all of you have more than 50? Yeah, I can't hear it. What? Yep. So there's a little scuttlebutt with this along legal scholars on whether or not you still have to meet that 50 employee within the 75-mile radius threshold. Most of the municipalities, public sector groups that I know, just go ahead and just do it. And they just go ahead and apply FMLA from that standpoint, because typically they have more than 50 employees, a lot of them, when they put all the departments and everything in together from where they're at. So we have to know that an eligible employee is eligible. They have to work for that employer for at least 12 months and work 1,250 hours. So to be eligible, the 12 months of employment do not need to be consecutive. So they could have started and then left and then come back, and that gets counted. Separate periods of employment are counted that do not exceed 7 years, and separate periods of employment will be counted if the break in service is more than 7 years, if it's military related from that standpoint. So basic provisions. 1, we know that FMLA does not require paid leave. That's why employees can use other types of leave. The law allows employers to require employees to use any paid leave, and the law also allows employees to use their paid time off during their FMLA if the use of PTO would meet normal requirements of use. So we know that we have that. Here's the thing. Concurrently running FMLA. This is what I wanted to get to make a big point about this. This is a question. Can FMLA be ran concurrently with other types of paid leave or other types of leave? The answer is yes. You can run it concurrently with workers' compensation. You can run it concurrently with any short-term disability plans that you have. You can run it concurrently with sick leave, with paid time off or vacation pay, or even with an accommodation underneath the ADA. You can run these things consecutively from that standpoint. So that's the thing to remember, because you don't necessarily want to say, oh, well, we have a short-term disability plan that gives people 6 weeks, and then we have FMLA, so that's going to be a total of 18 weeks. Well, no, not necessarily. You can run them concurrently, so it's just a total of 12 weeks under that plan. So keep that in mind as we're looking at FMLA and you're looking at your leaves running concurrently from that standpoint. Okay, I'm right on the time of leaving here. So PHI, protected health information, you all know to keep that safe. Don't share it with everyone that you learn about it from FMLA or anything like that. Only folks who need to know are the ones who should know it, and really it should just be between HR and the employee. It doesn't need to be talked about with other employees. Don't say things like, what condition do you or your family member have? What have you been diagnosed with? What are you and your family members seeing the doctor for? That's none of your business. That's none of anybody's business, but the paperwork that HR gives to the employee to have the doctor fill out, and for you, if you're reviewing it for an HR standpoint to determine leave availability, yes, you can know that, but other people should not know that, and those are questions that should not be asked. All right, so, well, we know this. You guys are all heard of at-will employment. You know how it works with public sector? Yep. So really, at-will employment doesn't necessarily apply, that you have to really justify being able to discipline someone and being able to terminate them in the public sector. So you want to make sure that you have those processes in place from that standpoint, et cetera. Union activity is a little limited when it comes to government agencies, and that employers cannot force an employee to make a statement that can be used against them in criminal proceedings, and that's called the Garrity rights. So just remember that. I wanted to make sure we hit on that one so you understand that as well. Okay, wrap up. So I know we went through a lot of information today. So are there any questions? I feel like I've just bombarded and I've talked at you guys all this whole entire time, but hopefully it's not felt that way to you. Questions? Yes. Yes, they will get you a copy of the slides from all of that. Yes. Any other questions, comments, feedback, hand gestures? Nope. Good. Well, thank you so much. I hope this was helpful. I hope you took away a lot of the information, and I appreciate you having me here. And don't forget to check out SHRM.